Welcome. I trust you are ready for a new mystery to unfold.
The Gentleman in the Crimson Waistcoat, a Hercule Poirot mystery. Welcome, dear listeners, to Cozy Mysteries. I'm Stephen, and tonight I bring you a tale that unfolded during one of London's most glittering social events. A story that would test even the remarkable deductive powers of the world's greatest detective. Chapter 1. The Stranger at the Gala. The evening of October 15th, 1924 found the ballroom of the Grosvenor Hotel ablaze with crystal chandeliers and the murmur of polite society. Lady Pemberton's annual charity gala had drawn the cream of London's elite, all gathered to support the cause of war orphans. Among the familiar faces, the predictable assembly of dowagers, diplomats and debutantes moved a stranger who commanded attention like a magnet draws iron filings. He was perhaps 40 years of age, tall and distinguished, with silver threading through his dark hair and eyes the colour of winter seas. But it was his waistcoat that caught every eye, a magnificent creation of crimson silk that seemed to glow beneath the ballroom lights. The garment was clearly of the finest quality, embroidered with subtle golden threads that caught the light with each movement. "Who is that fascinating man?" whispered Mrs. Cordelia Ashworth to her companion, Lady Margaret Fairfax, as they observed from their position near the potted palms. "I haven't the faintest idea," replied Lady Margaret, adjusting her opera glasses for a better view, "but he's certainly causing quite a stir. Indeed, the mysterious gentleman seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to charm. He moved through the crowd with easy confidence, engaging each person he met in animated conversation. His laugh was infectious, his compliments perfectly pitched, and his knowledge of art, literature and current affairs appeared encyclopedic. Lady Pemberton herself was quite taken with him. Such a delightful addition to our little gathering," she confided to the Duchess of Marlborough. "He mentioned he was recently returned from India, something about tea plantations, I believe. Most exotic." The stranger's effect on the ladies was particularly pronounced. Young Miss Caroline Pemberton, the hostess's daughter, seemed positively entranced as he regaled her with tales of tiger hunts and monsoon rains. Mrs. Victoria Blackwood, a widow of considerable means and reputation, laughed more than she had in months as he described the peculiarities of colonial life. Even the normally reserved Miss Judith Hartwell, secretary to several prominent charitable organizations, appeared flushed with excitement after their brief conversation. As the evening progressed, the gentleman in the crimson waistcoat became something of a celebrity. Guests pointed him out to newcomers, speculation about his identity grew more elaborate with each passing hour, and several hostesses were already planning to invite him to their own upcoming events, if only they could discover his name and direction. It was precisely at 11:30 that disaster struck. Lady Pemberton had descended to the hotel's wine cellar to select a particularly fine champagne for the evening's final toast. The cellar, located in the basement of the hotel, was accessible through a discreet service stair behind the main kitchen. It was there, among the dusty bottles and cobwebbed alcoves, that she discovered him. The gentleman in the crimson waistcoat lay motionless between two towering wine racks, his distinctive garment now serving as a tragic marker in the dim light. His face, which had been so animated with life mere hours before, was now peaceful in death. His winter sea eyes closed forever. Lady Pemberton's screams brought the hotel staff running, followed quickly by several guests who had been searching for late-arriving refreshments. Within minutes, the cellar had become the scene of considerable confusion as people crowded forward to see what had happened. "Stand back, everyone stand back," commanded Inspector Bradshaw of Scotland Yard, who had arrived with remarkable promptness, having been attending the gala himself in his capacity as the Chief Constable's representative. But the damage was done. The scene had been thoroughly compromised by well-meaning guests and concerned staff members. Footprints crossed and recrossed the dusty floor, the victim's clothing had been adjusted by those checking for signs of life, and any hope of preserving the crime scene in its original state had vanished like morning mist. Dr. Henderson, who had also been among the guests, conducted a preliminary examination. "No obvious signs of violence," he murmured to Inspector Bradshaw. Could be natural causes, heart failure perhaps, though in a man so apparently vigorous. He left the sentence hanging like a question mark in the stale air. It was then that someone made the most disturbing discovery of all. Despite his obvious popularity at the gala, despite the animated conversations and the clear fascination he had inspired, not a single guest could provide his name. The gentleman in the crimson waistcoat had moved through the evening like a phantom, charming all he met while revealing nothing of substance about himself. Surely someone must know who he is, Inspector Bradshaw inquired of the assembled guests, but heads shook in confusion and embarrassment. The man who had been the evening's most memorable figure had become its greatest mystery. Lady Pemberton, having recovered somewhat from her shock, wrung her hands in distress. But he must have been invited. No one enters my gala without an invitation. The staff checks every name at the door. A hurried consultation with the hotel's reception staff only deepened the mystery. The guest list showed no uninvited attendees, yet no one could recall exactly who had admitted the charming stranger, or which invitation he had presented. As the evening dissolved into chaos and whispered speculation, one small, neat gentleman stood quietly observing from the corner of the ballroom, his green eyes taking in every detail with the precision of a camera lens. Hercule Poirot had arrived. Chapter 2. The little grey cells begin their work. The following morning found our Belgian detective in his modest lodgings, delicately adjusting his moustache while reviewing the peculiar circumstances that had brought him to the Grosvenor Hotel's wine cellar. Inspector Bradshaw, recognizing the limits of conventional police work when faced with such an unusual case, had reluctantly agreed to consult the famous investigator. "The whole thing is preposterous, Poirot," Bradshaw had complained the previous evening. "A man appears at a society gala, charms everyone he meets, then turns up dead in the wine cellar, with no one knowing who he is. It's like something from a penny dreadful." Poirot had merely stroked his moustache thoughtfully. "In my experience, Inspector, the most preposterous cases often contain the most illuminating truths. But tell me, what did the doctor's more thorough examination reveal?" "That's another odd thing," Bradshaw had replied, consulting his notebook. "Dr. Henderson found traces of a bitter almond scent about the victim's mouth. Suggests cyanide poisoning, though he'll need to conduct a proper post-mortem to be certain." "Ah," Poirot had murmured. "So we have murder most definitely. And yet in a room full of people, our victim dies alone in a wine cellar that should have been deserted. Most interesting." Now, as Poirot carefully arranged his breakfast, 2 boiled eggs of precisely equal size, toast cut into perfect triangles, and coffee prepared according to his exacting specifications, he allowed his little grey cells to examine the curious facts of the case. First, there was the matter of the victim's identity. A man does not simply materialize at a society function without leaving some trace of his existence. Yet the mysterious gentleman appeared to have done exactly that. No hotel registration, no calling card left with any guest, no mention of mutual acquaintances or common friends. Second, there was the question of the invitation. Lady Pemberton maintained strict control over her guest list, yet somehow the stranger had gained entry. This suggested either an administrative error of remarkable proportions or something far more deliberate. Third, and perhaps most intriguing, was the matter of the victim's extraordinary charm. In Poirot's experience, people who worked so hard to be universally loved often had compelling reasons for wishing to remain anonymous. A knock at the door interrupted his meditations. His landlady announced the arrival of Inspector Bradshaw, who entered bearing a manila envelope and an expression of barely contained excitement. "Poirot, you'll never guess what we've discovered about our mysterious gentleman," Bradshaw began, settling his bulk into the small chair opposite the detective. "I would prefer not to guess, mon ami. I would prefer that you tell me, right then. We've searched through his clothing thoroughly, expensive stuff, all of it, but with the labels removed. However, hidden in the lining of his jacket, we found this." Bradshaw produced a small folded piece of paper. "It's a receipt from Harrods, dated 3 days ago. Purchase of one gentleman's waistcoat, crimson silk with gold embroidery. Price £15, 10 shillings. Poirot's eyebrows rose slightly. £15 for a waistcoat. Our victim was either very wealthy or very desperate to make an impression. What name appears on this receipt? That's just it. It was a cash purchase. No name required, but the sales clerk might remember him. Indeed. And have you visited this establishment? Not yet. Thought you might want to come along. Within the hour, Poirot and Bradshaw found themselves in the luxurious surroundings of Harrod's gentleman's department. The sales clerk who had handled the transaction, a precise man named Thornbury, remembered the purchase well. "Oh yes, most certainly I recall the gentleman," Thornbury said, his voice carrying the refined tones of one accustomed to serving the wealthy. "Quite particular about the color, he was. Said it absolutely had to be crimson, not burgundy, not scarlet, but crimson specifically. Spent nearly an hour examining different fabrics." "Did he mention why the color was so important?" Poirot inquired. "As a matter of fact he did. Said he was attending a special event where he needed to stand out from the crowd and make an unforgettable impression. His exact words, I believe." Poirot exchanged a meaningful glance with Bradshaw. "And his manner, how would you describe it?" Thornbury considered carefully. "Nervous, I would say. Excited, but nervous. He kept checking his pocket watch and muttering about everything having to be perfect. Oh, and he insisted on wearing the waistcoat immediately, wouldn't hear of having it delivered. One more question if you please. Did he arrive alone?" "No, actually, there was a lady waiting outside. I glimpsed her through the window. Elegantly dressed, dark hair, rather striking. She seemed impatient, checking her own timepiece frequently." As they left Harrod's, Poirot appeared lost in thought. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to take shape, though the picture they formed was still unclear. "What do you make of it, Poirot?" Bradshaw asked as they hailed a cab. "I think, mon ami, that our victim was preparing for a performance, one that required a very specific costume. The question now becomes who was his intended audience, and why did someone decide the show should never reach its final act?" The cab carried them back toward the Grosvenor Hotel, where Poirot intended to examine the wine cellar more thoroughly. But as they passed through Piccadilly, something caught his eye in the window of a small photographer's studio. "Stop," he called to the driver. "Stop immediately." In the window among the usual wedding portraits and family photographs was displayed a picture that made Poirot's pulse quicken. It showed a gentleman in a crimson waistcoat, but this photograph had clearly been taken some time before the previous evening's gala. The man's pose was formal, studio arranged, and in the corner was the photographer's stamp. "Portrait completed October 10th, 1924. 5 days before the gala, 5 days before the mysterious gentleman had supposedly appeared as a charming stranger." The little grey cells began to work overtime. Chapter 3. The Ladies with Lockets. The photographer's studio, of Mr. Augustus Finch, occupied a narrow building, squeezed between a haberdashery and a tea shop on Jermyn Street. When Poirot and Inspector Bradshaw arrived, they found Mr. Finch, a thin man with paint-stained fingers and artistic pretensions, carefully arranging a display of his latest work. "You've noticed my window display," Finch said, following their gaze to the photograph of the gentleman in the crimson waistcoat. "Rather striking, isn't it? One of my finest compositions, if I may say so." "Indeed," Poirot replied smoothly. "We are most interested in this particular gentleman. Might we inquire about the circumstances of this photograph?" Finch's artistic enthusiasm was immediately dampened by a look of commercial wariness. "I'm afraid I maintain strict confidentiality regarding my clients. Professional ethics, you understand." Inspector Bradshaw produced his warrant card. "This is a police investigation, Mr. Finch. The gentleman in question was found dead last evening." The photographer's face went pale. "Dead? But that's impossible. He was here just last week, full of life and plans for the future." "Plans?" Poirot interjected, his green eyes sharpening with interest. "What manner of plans?" Finch wrung his hands nervously. "He commissioned 3 copies of that portrait. Said he needed them for sentimental purposes, his exact words. Very particular about the quality, insisted on my finest paper and most careful development." 3 copies, Poirot murmured thoughtfully. "And did he mention to whom these copies were intended?" "Well, he did say something rather odd. He said they were for 3 ladies who would treasure them always. Struck me as rather presumptuous, if you ask me. I mean, what lady treasures a photograph of a gentleman she's only just met?" Bradshaw and Poirot exchanged significant glances. Did he give you a name, Mr. Finch? The inspector asked. Called himself Mr. Sinclair, David Sinclair, paid in cash, like so many do these days. But, Finch hesitated, looking suddenly uncomfortable. But, Poirot prompted gently. Well, while he was posing, he kept muttering to himself, seemed to be rehearsing lines, like an actor preparing for a role. I heard him say things like delighted to make your acquaintance and I've just returned from India, that sort of thing. Thought it rather peculiar. The investigation was taking on an increasingly theatrical quality. Poirot requested to examine the photographer's order book, which revealed that Mr. Sinclair had been quite specific about the timing of his photograph. He had insisted that the portraits be ready by October 12, exactly 3 days before the gala. As they left the studio, Poirot was deep in contemplation. 3 photographs, mon ami, 3 ladies, and now we know our victim was preparing his performance well in advance. But which 3 ladies? Bradshaw wondered aloud. That should not be difficult to ascertain. We must return to the scene of last evening's drama and make some discreet inquiries among the female guests. The Grosvenor Hotel's morning-after atmosphere was considerably more subdued than the previous evening's gaiety. Lady Pemberton, though shaken by the events, had agreed to meet with the investigators in the hotel's private dining room. 3 ladies who seemed particularly taken with our mysterious gentleman. She repeated Poirot's question thoughtfully. Well, certainly my daughter Caroline was quite enchanted by him, and Mrs. Victoria Blackwood appeared most animated during their conversation. And Miss Judith Hartwell, you know she's usually so reserved, but she was positively glowing after speaking with him. Poirot made careful note of these names. Would it be possible to speak with these ladies? Perhaps this afternoon. I'm sure arrangements could be made, Lady Pemberton replied. Though I must warn you, they're all rather distressed by what's happened. Caroline particularly, she seems to have developed quite a fascination with the poor man. The first interview was with Miss Caroline Pemberton, a lovely young woman of 23 with golden hair and blue eyes that showed evidence of recent tears. She received them in her mother's drawing room, twisting a lace handkerchief nervously in her hands. I simply cannot believe he's dead, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He was so alive, so charming. He told me the most wonderful stories about India, about tiger hunts and mysterious temples and native festivals. Miss Pemberton, Poirot said gently, I wonder if you might show us any mementos you have of the gentleman. A calling card, perhaps, or… Caroline's cheeks flushed pink. Well, there is something. She reached for a small silver locket at her throat. With trembling fingers she opened it to reveal a miniature photograph, the very portrait they had seen at Mr. Finch's studio. He gave this to me last evening, she whispered. Said I reminded him of someone very dear to him in India. It was so romantic. Poirot examined the locket carefully. The photograph had been expertly cut to fit the oval frame, and the workmanship was of the highest quality. Did he mention this dear someone's name? He called her his lost love, said she had died of fever, and that seeing me brought back bittersweet memories. Oh, Inspector, I feel such a fool for believing such stories. The second interview, with Mrs. Victoria Blackwood, took place at her elegant townhouse in Belgravia. Mrs. Blackwood, a handsome widow of 45 with dark hair and intelligent eyes, received them in her morning room. She seemed less emotionally affected than Miss Pemberton, but Poirot noticed she too wore a locket. Yes, he gave me this photograph, she admitted when asked directly. Said I resembled his late sister, who had died tragically young. He seemed so sincere, so grief-stricken by the memory. I felt quite sorry for him. His late sister, Poirot repeated thoughtfully, and this resemblance, it was strong, according to him. Yes, he said I had the same eyes, the same way of holding my head when listening intently. It was rather touching actually. The third interview proved the most illuminating. Miss Judith Hartwell, a spinster of 38 who devoted her life to charitable works, received them in her modest flat in Bloomsbury. Unlike the others, she seemed almost defiant when they broached the subject of the mysterious gentleman. Yes, I have his photograph, she said, producing a third locket. And before you ask, he told me I reminded him of his dear mother, who had sacrificed everything to give him a good start in life. He said seeing me made him think of all the good he wanted to do in the world.
Poirot studied Miss Hartwell's intelligent face. Unlike the others, she showed no signs of romantic infatuation or sentimental attachment. And you believe this story, mademoiselle? Miss Hartwell's laugh was sharp. Mr. Poirot, I may be a spinster devoted to charitable works, but I am not a fool. The gentleman's story was clearly fabricated, but, she paused, her expression softening slightly. He seemed so desperate to create some connection, some reason for his presence at the gala. I felt rather sorry for him, actually. As they left Miss Hartwell's flat, Inspector Bradshaw shook his head in amazement. 3 different women, 3 different stories, 3 identical photographs. What was this fellow playing at? Poirot's expression was thoughtful. I begin to think, mon ami, that our victim was not merely preparing for a performance. He was auditioning for a role. The question is, which of these 3 ladies was his intended leading actress? Chapter 4. Threads of Silk and Whispers of Perfume. The next morning brought an unseasonably warm October day, and Poirot found himself once again in the wine cellar of the Grosvenor Hotel. Inspector Bradshaw had obtained permission for a more thorough examination of the scene, and our Belgian detective intended to search for clues that might have been overlooked in the previous evening's confusion. The cellar was a study in contrasts, ancient stone walls lined with modern wine racks, electric lighting, casting harsh shadows among bottles that had aged in darkness for decades. The chalk outline where the victim had been found lay between 2 towering sections devoted to French burgundies. Poirot moved slowly through the space, his keen eyes noting every detail. The floor was stone, covered with a fine layer of dust that had been thoroughly disturbed by the previous evening's foot traffic. However, near the far corner, away from the main path through the cellar, he noticed something that made him pause. "Regardez, Inspector," he called softly, kneeling beside a wine rack. Caught on a protruding cork was a single thread of silk, deep blue in color, and of obviously fine quality. Bradshaw hurried over, producing a small envelope to preserve the evidence. "Could be from the victim's clothing." "None," Poirot said, examining the thread carefully. "Our gentleman wore black evening clothes beneath his crimson waistcoat. This blue silk suggests a lady's garment. Someone else was in this cellar, someone wearing an expensive blue dress or shawl." They continued their search methodically. Near the wine cellar's entrance, Poirot discovered a second clue that proved even more intriguing. A faint but unmistakable scent lingering in the air. He inhaled deeply, his expression becoming increasingly puzzled. "Inspector, do you detect any particular fragrance in this area?" Bradshaw sniffed obligingly. "Can't say I do, Poirot. Just the usual cellar smells: wine, stone, mustiness, presentiment. But here, by the entrance, there is something else. A perfume, very expensive, very distinctive. It has what you English call staying power." Poirot's knowledge of perfumes was encyclopedic, a legacy of his Belgian upbringing in a country renowned for its appreciation of fine scents. This particular fragrance teased at his memory, sophisticated, complex, with notes of jasmine and sandalwood that spoke of Parisian perfumeries and considerable expense. "Could you identify it?" Bradshaw asked hopefully. "Perhaps, but first, we must speak with the hotel staff. Someone may have noticed which guests visited the lower floors during the evening." Their inquiries with the hotel staff proved frustrating. The charity gala had been a bustling affair, with guest staff and service personnel moving constantly throughout the building. The wine cellar was officially off-limits to guests, but several staff members admitted that the restriction was not strictly enforced, particularly for Lady Pemberton herself, who had a well-known appreciation for fine wines. However, one piece of information proved particularly interesting. James, the senior wine steward, mentioned that he had seen a lady in a blue evening dress near the service stairs around 10 o'clock, roughly an hour before the body was discovered. "Couldn't see her face clearly," James explained. "She was ascending the stairs as I was coming down to fetch champagne for the final toasts. Elegant lady, though moved like quality, if you know what I mean." "And you did not think to question her presence?" James looked embarrassed. "Well, sir, with so many distinguished guests, I assumed she was one of Lady Pemberton's intimate friends, perhaps helping with the wine selection." Back in his lodgings, Poirot consulted his extensive notes on perfumes, a reference collection that had proven invaluable in previous cases. The scent from the wine cellar nagged at his memory with its familiar yet elusive character. It was while reviewing his notes on expensive Parisian fragrances that the identification finally came to him. Nude de Jasmine, he murmured aloud. Created exclusively by Maison Guerlain for a very select clientele. The perfume was notable not only for its complexity and cost, but also for its rarity. Only a few bottles were produced each year, and each was registered to its purchaser. If their mysterious lady in blue wore Nude de Jasmine, her identity might be traced through Guerlain's London representatives. The house of Guerlain's London cellar occupied prestigious quarters in Bond Street. Madame Dubois, the salon's directress, was a formidable woman with steel-grey hair and an encyclopedic knowledge of her exclusive clientele. Nude de Jasmine, she repeated when Poirot made his inquiry. But certainly, monsieur. We have only 3 clients in London who purchase this particular fragrance. She consulted a leather-bound ledger with obvious pride in her meticulous record-keeping. There is the Duchess of Marlborough, but she is currently in Scotland, I believe. Lady Cynthia Worthington, but she has been in Paris for the past month. And she paused, her finger tracing down the page. Mrs. Victoria Blackwood of Belgravia. Poirot felt the familiar thrill that accompanied a significant breakthrough. Mrs. Blackwood, one of the 3 ladies who had received the mysterious gentleman's photograph, one of the 3 who had been charmed by his stories of resemblance to lost loved ones. When did Mrs. Blackwood last purchase this perfume? He inquired. Madame Dubois consulted another ledger. Just last week, as it happens, October 9th, a full bottle, our largest size. The timing was significant. The perfume had been purchased just 1 day before the victim had his portrait taken at Mr. Finch's studio. The threads of the mystery were beginning to weave together into a pattern, though the complete picture remained frustratingly unclear. That afternoon, Poirot paid an unexpected visit to Mrs. Blackwood's townhouse. He found her in her garden, tending to late-blooming roses with the focused attention of someone seeking distraction from troubling thoughts.
Mr. Poirot, she said, looking up from her pruning with obvious surprise. I wasn't expecting to see you again so soon. Forgive the intrusion, madam, but I find myself curious about certain aspects of your encounter with our mysterious gentleman. You mentioned that he said you resembled his late sister. Mrs. Blackwood's hands stilled on her pruning shears. Yes, that's correct. And this resemblance, when did he first notice it? What do you mean? I mean, madam, did he mention this resemblance when you were first introduced, or was it something that occurred to him during your conversation? Mrs. Blackwood was quiet for a long moment, her dark eyes studying Poirot's face. When she finally spoke, her voice was carefully controlled. You know, now that you mention it, he seemed to recognize me immediately, almost as if he had been expecting to see me there. She paused, then added quietly, I found it rather strange at the time, but the evening was so unusual. As Poirot walked back through the crisp October air, his mind was busy with calculations. The mysterious gentleman had known exactly who would be at Lady Pemberton's gala. He had prepared photographs specifically for 3 ladies who would be in attendance, and one of those ladies wore a perfume so rare that her presence in the wine cellar could be traced with virtual certainty. But if Mrs. Blackwood had been in the wine cellar, why? And more importantly, had she been there as the victim's accomplice or as his murderer? The little grey cells worked furiously, but the answers remained tantalizingly out of reach. Chapter 5. The Doctored Guest List. The revelation about Mrs. Blackwood's presence in the wine cellar necessitated a more thorough investigation into the evening's logistics. Poirot had learned from experience that murders at social gatherings often hinged on the careful manipulation of guest lists, seating arrangements, and the subtle choreography of high society events. Lady Pemberton received him in her morning room, still visibly shaken by the events at her gala. She clutched a cup of tea as if it were a lifeline, her usually perfect composure replaced by the haggard appearance of someone who had slept poorly. The guest list, she repeated when Poirot made his request. Yes, of course, though I must warn you, it's quite extensive. I pride myself on hosting the most inclusive charitable events in London. She produced a leather-bound book containing meticulously handwritten entries. Poirot examined it carefully, noting the elegant penmanship and the systematic organization of names by category, family, close friends, prominent society figures, business associates, and charitable supporters. "This is most thorough, madam," Poirot observed. "But tell me, who else had access to this list during the planning stages?" "Well, my secretary, Miss Hartwell, helped with the organization. She's so efficient with such matters. And my daughter Caroline, of course, as she assisted with the invitations. Mrs. Blackwood also offered her help, given her extensive charitable connections." Poirot's eyebrows rose slightly. "Mrs. Blackwood assisted with the guest list." "Oh yes, she was most helpful. Suggested several names of potential donors and helped review the final arrangements. She has such good judgment about these things." "And when did she provide this assistance?" Lady Pemberton consulted a small diary. "Let me see, it was early October, I believe. Yes, here it is, October 8th. She came for tea and spent the entire afternoon helping to finalize the arrangements." The date struck Poirot like a bell tolling. October 8th. One day before Mrs. Blackwood had purchased her expensive perfume, 2 days before the mysterious gentleman had commissioned his photographs. The timing suggested a level of coordination that transformed their understanding of the crime. "Might I examine the actual invitations that were sent?" Poirot asked. Lady Pemberton led him to her study, where boxes of correspondence were neatly organized by date. The invitations had been produced by a high-end printing firm in elegant script on heavy paper stock. But as Poirot examined them more closely, he noticed something peculiar about the guest numbering system. Each invitation bore a small reference number in the lower right corner, a security measure to prevent forgeries and ensure accurate attendance counts. However, one number in the sequence appeared to be missing entirely. "Lady Pemberton," Poirot said carefully, "your invitation numbering runs from 001 to 247, yet I notice that 156 is absent from your files. Was this invitation destroyed or returned?" Lady Pemberton examined the gap with obvious confusion. "How very strange. I don't recall any problems with that particular invitation. Perhaps it was a printing error." But Poirot's sharp eyes had noticed something else. In the guest book from the evening, the record of actual attendees invitation number 156 had been checked off as present. Someone had attended the gala using an invitation that officially did not exist. A visit to the printing firm, Messrs. Hartwell and Sons, no relation to Miss Judith Hartwell, provided additional illumination. Mr. Edmund Hartwell, the senior partner, remembered the Lady Pemberton order well. Most particular about the security features, she was, he explained. Insisted on the numbering system and watermarked paper. However, there was one unusual request. A lady called to order one additional invitation, claiming it was for a last-minute addition to the guest list. "Can you describe this lady?" Elegant voice, very refined, said she was Mrs. Blackwood, calling on Lady Pemberton's behalf. "We don't usually accommodate such requests, but the lady was most persuasive, and the order had been paid in full." The web of deception was becoming clearer. Mrs. Blackwood had not only helped plan the guest list, but had also arranged for an extra invitation, presumably for the mysterious gentleman who had charmed his way through the evening before meeting his death in the wine cellar. That afternoon Poirot requested another interview with Mrs. Blackwood. This time he found her in her drawing room, arranging white chrysanthemums in a crystal vase. Her movements were precise and controlled, but he noticed a slight tremor in her hands that betrayed her inattention. "Mrs. Blackwood," he began carefully, "I find myself most interested in your assistance with Lady Pemberton's guest list. Such charitable dedication is admirable." "Lady Pemberton is an old friend," she replied without looking up from her flowers. "I was happy to help ensure her gala would be a success." "Indeed. And I wonder, did you perhaps suggest any particular gentleman for inclusion? Someone recently returned from India, perhaps?" The chrysanthemum stem snapped in Mrs. Blackwood's fingers. For a moment her composure cracked entirely, and Poirot glimpsed the strain beneath her elegant facade. "I don't know what you're implying, Mr. Poirot." "I imply nothing, madame. I merely seek to understand the events that led to a man's death." "A man who seemed to know exactly who would be attending the gala," exactly which ladies he wished to charm, and exactly where to find the most expensive perfume in London. Mrs. Blackwood set down the broken flower and faced him directly. Her dark eyes were steady, but her voice carried the weight of someone who had been carrying a heavy burden. "You're very perceptive, Mr. Poirot. Yes, I helped arrange for David's invitation, but you must understand, I thought I was helping him, not leading him to his death."
David?
David Marlowe. Not Sinclair, as he told the photographer. That was just another of his deceptions. She moved to the window, staring out at the London street. "We knew each other years ago, before my marriage. He had gotten himself into some sort of trouble, gambling debts I think, and needed to disappear for a while. India was his refuge, and when did he return? 3 weeks ago. He contacted me, said he needed to meet wealthy women, potential investors for a business venture. He claimed he had legitimate opportunities in tea plantations." Her laugh was bitter. "I should have known better, but he was always so persuasive." "So you arranged for him to attend the gala?" "I thought one evening of harmless flirtation might help him make useful connections. I never imagined." She turned back to face Poirot, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I never imagined someone would want him dead." But even as Mrs. Blackwood confessed to her role in the deception, Poirot sensed she was still holding something back. The woman who had purchased rare perfume just before the gala, who had been seen in a blue dress near the wine cellar, who had helped orchestrate the victim's presence at the event, she knew more than she was revealing. "Mrs. Blackwood," Poirot said gently, "I believe you went to the wine cellar that evening. The perfume you wear is most distinctive, and traces of it linger there still." Her face went very pale. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I went to the cellar. David had asked me to meet him there at 10:30. He said he had something important to tell me, something about why he had really returned to London." "And did he tell you?" Mrs. Blackwood was quiet for a long moment, her hands twisting together in her lap. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "He never had the chance. When I arrived, he was already gone." The confession hung in the air between them like a challenge, but Poirot's keen instincts told him that even this revelation was only another layer of the complex deception that had led to murder in the wine cellar of the Grosvenor Hotel. Chapter 6. The victim's true identity. The morning following Mrs. Blackwood's partial confession found Poirot in the reading room of the British Museum, surrounded by back issues of newspapers and periodicals. If David Marlowe had fled to India several years earlier due to some scandal or trouble, there might be traces of his story in the social columns and police reports of the time. Inspector Bradshaw joined him shortly after 10 o'clock, looking rather out of place among the scholarly atmosphere, but carrying a folder of documents that suggested his own investigations had borne fruit. "I've been making inquiries about our Mr. Marlowe," Bradshaw announced, settling into a chair beside Poirot's research table. "Turns out Scotland Yard has quite a file on him." "Ah, excellent. Pray enlighten me about our victim's past." Bradshaw opened his folder and began reading. "David Marlowe, born 1884, son of a minor diplomat. Good family, excellent education, but a taste for gambling and expensive living that exceeded his means. First came to police attention in 1919 for a confidence scheme involving forged railway shares. Continue, I pray you." Charges were dropped when the victims declined to testify. Apparently Marlowe had compromising information about their own business dealings. But he didn't learn his lesson. In 1921, he was suspected of involvement in a jewel theft at a country house party. Again no charges were filed, but he left England rather suddenly for India. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. A man who specialized in exploiting the wealthy and well-connected, and his method. According to the reports, he was a master of what we might call social infiltration. He would research his targets thoroughly, discover their weaknesses and desires, then present himself as exactly what they were looking for. Very charming, very convincing, and very dangerous, it would seem, given his current condition. What of his time in India? That's where it gets interesting, Bradshaw said, producing another set of documents. "I contacted the Calcutta police through the colonial office.
Marlowe was involved in several questionable business ventures there, always skirting the edge of legality, always managing to disappear just before the authorities closed in. Poirot examined a photograph that had been included with the police file. It showed David Marlowe, as he had appeared in 1921, younger, but with the same piercing eyes and confident bearing that had made him so effective at the charity gala. But something changed recently, Bradshaw continued. According to my contacts in Calcutta, Marlowe left India in quite a hurry about a month ago. There were rumors of a major confidence scheme gone wrong, possibly involving the wives of several high-ranking colonial officials. Ah, Poirot murmured. So he returned to London, not as a successful tea plantation owner, but as a fugitive seeking to rebuild his fortunes through familiar methods. Exactly, and Mrs. Blackwood provided him with the perfect opportunity, a gathering of wealthy socially prominent women, all potential targets for his schemes. But as Poirot reviewed the police files, one detail caught his attention that seemed inconsistent with their current understanding of the case. According to the reports, David Marlowe's preferred method of operation was slow and careful. He would cultivate relationships over weeks or months before making his move. The approach at Lady Pemberton's gala had been far more rushed and obvious. Inspector, Poirot said slowly, does it not strike you as strange that a man of Marlowe's experience would risk exposing himself so dramatically? 3 photographs, 3 elaborate stories, all in a single evening. This was not the behavior of a careful confidence man. Bradshaw frowned as he considered this point. You think he was being pressured somehow, forced to work more quickly than usual? Perhaps, or perhaps his true purpose that evening was not what we have assumed. Their discussion was interrupted by the arrival of a young clerk from Scotland Yard, who presented Bradshaw with an urgent telegram. As the inspector read it, his expression grew increasingly grave. What is it? Poirot inquired. News from Calcutta, Bradshaw replied grimly. The authorities there have discovered that David Marlowe didn't just flee India due to a confidence scheme. He's wanted for questioning in connection with the murder of Colonel Harrison's wife. Apparently she discovered his fraudulent activities and threatened to expose him. The revelation cast their case in an entirely new light. If David Marlowe was already a suspected murderer, then his death in the wine cellar might have been an act of justice rather than simple murder. But it also raised troubling questions about who else might have known of his violent past. We must speak with Mrs. Blackwood again, Poirot declared, rising from his chair. If she knew about Marlowe's true character, her involvement in this affair becomes far more complex. They found Mrs. Blackwood at home, but she was not alone. Miss Judith Hartwell was taking tea with her in the drawing room, and both women looked up with obvious anxiety when the butler announced Poirot and Bradshaw's arrival. Forgive the intrusion, ladies, Poirot said smoothly, but we have some additional questions about Mr. Marlowe, or should I say, about his activities in India. Miss Hartwell's teacup rattled against its saucer as she set it down. I'm afraid I don't understand what you mean, Mr. Poirot. Did you know, Miss Hartwell, that David Marlowe was suspected of murder in Calcutta? The death of a lady who had discovered his fraudulent business activities. The colour drained from both women's faces, but it was Mrs. Blackwood who spoke first. We had heard rumours, she admitted quietly. Miss Hartwell has connections in the Colonial Office through her charitable work. When David contacted me about attending the gala, Judith advised me to be cautious. Yet you still arranged his invitation, Bradshaw observed. Miss Hartwell leaned forward urgently. You must understand, Inspector, we thought we could manage the situation, control it. We planned to watch him carefully throughout the evening, make sure he didn't harm anyone. But something went wrong, Poirot said gently. Everything went wrong, Mrs. Blackwood whispered. David wasn't interested in finding new victims at the gala. He was being blackmailed by someone who knew about the murder in India. That's why he needed to meet wealthy women, not to defraud them, but to find someone willing to pay for his silence about their own secrets. The pieces of the puzzle were shifting again, revealing a picture far more complex than simple murder, or even justified revenge. David Marlowe had come to Lady Pemberton's gala, not as a hunter, but as prey, stalked by someone who knew his darkest secret and intended to use it against him. Who was blackmailing him? Poirot asked. Mrs. Blackwood and Miss Hartwell exchanged a meaningful glance. It was Miss Hartwell who finally answered, her voice steady despite the gravity of her words. Someone who had also been in India, someone who knew about Colonel Harrison's wife, someone who had been waiting 3 years for the perfect opportunity for revenge. The revelation hung in the air like a sword about to fall. But before either woman could elaborate further, the drawing-room door opened, and Lady Pemberton herself entered, her face pale, but her manner determined. "I think," she said quietly, "it's time I told you about my sister Margaret, and why David Marlowe had to die." Chapter 7. Secrets of the Colonial Past. Lady Pemberton moved into the drawing-room, with the deliberate grace of someone who had made a momentous decision. She settled herself in the chair opposite Poirot, her hands folded calmly in her lap, but her eyes betrayed the emotional storm beneath her composed exterior. "My sister Margaret was Colonel Harrison's wife," she began without preamble. "Margaret Harrison, née Pemberton. She was 3 years younger than I, beautiful, spirited, and utterly trusting in the goodness of others. It was a trait that would ultimately prove fatal." Mrs. Blackwood and Miss Hartwell remained silent, their faces reflecting a mixture of sympathy and apprehension. Inspector Bradshaw had his notebook ready, but Poirot simply listened with the intense concentration he reserved for crucial revelations. Margaret married Colonel Harrison in 1919 and accompanied him to Calcutta the following year. Her letters were full of enthusiasm for colonial life, the social whirl, the exotic landscapes, the sense of being part of the great imperial enterprise. But gradually her tone began to change. Lady Pemberton paused, reaching for a glass of water with hands that trembled slightly. By 1921, Margaret's letters spoke of troubling developments. There was a charming gentleman, a Mr. Marlowe, who had become part of their social circle. He claimed to be establishing tea plantations and seeking investors for legitimate business ventures. Several of the colonial wives had invested substantial sums with him, including your sister, Poirot asked gently. Yes, Margaret invested £5,000 money from her own inheritance, funds that were meant to provide for her future security. But more than that, she had convinced several of her friends to invest as well. When the business began to collapse, and questions were raised about missing funds, Margaret discovered that Mr. Marlowe's entire enterprise was fraudulent. Bradshaw looked up from his notes, and she confronted him. She did more than confront him. Margaret was not content to simply expose his financial crimes. She had discovered something far more damaging, evidence that Mr. Marlowe had been involved in other criminal activities, including the mysterious death of a wealthy widow in Bombay, whose estate he had subsequently inherited through a forged will. The room fell silent as the implications of this revelation sank in. David Marlowe had not been merely a confidence man, but a systematic killer who used his charm and social connections to eliminate wealthy victims. Margaret gathered evidence methodically. Lady Pemberton continued. Documents, witness statements, correspondence that proved Marlowe's pattern of criminal behavior. She intended to present everything to the authorities and ensure he faced justice for all his crimes. But she never got the chance, Poirot observed. No. On the evening of September 15, 1921, Margaret was found dead in her bungalow. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, but there were inconsistencies in the medical examination. Her personal papers had been ransacked, and all evidence she had gathered against Marlowe had vanished. Mrs. Blackwood leaned forward in her chair. "How did you learn all this, Elizabeth?" Margaret's letters never mentioned such specific details. Lady Pemberton's smile was grim. "Because I traveled to India myself in early 1922. I couldn't accept the official explanation of Margaret's death, and I was determined to discover the truth. What I found there was a conspiracy of silence, colonial officials who preferred to avoid scandal, medical authorities who had been pressured to minimize the investigation, and social circles that had been thoroughly intimidated by Marlowe's connections." "But you found witnesses," Poirot suggested. "I found Margaret's ayah, her personal maid, who had been too frightened to speak to the authorities. The woman had seen Marlowe leaving Margaret's bungalow on the night of her death, and she had overheard their final conversation. Margaret had confronted him with her evidence, and threatened to expose him unless he made full restitution to his victims. Bradshaw was writing furiously. And Marlowe's response, according to the Aya, he was initially conciliatory, even apologetic. He asked Margaret to show him exactly what evidence she had gathered, claiming he wanted to make things right. But once he had seen the extent of her investigation, Lady Pemberton's voice caught slightly. The maid heard Margaret cry out, then everything went silent. "Why did you not report this to the authorities at the time?" Poirot asked. "I tried. But by 1922, Marlowe had already fled India, and the colonial administration was more interested in burying the scandal than pursuing justice. They claimed there was insufficient evidence for a formal investigation, and several officials made it clear that my continued inquiries were unwelcome." Miss Hartwell spoke for the first time since Lady Pemberton's arrival. "So you returned to London and waited." "I waited, and I watched. I knew that someone like Marlowe would eventually return to England. Men of his type always gravitate toward familiar hunting grounds. I made certain inquiries through charitable organizations, maintained connections with people who might encounter him in social circles. And when he contacted Mrs. Blackwood about attending your gala," Poirot prompted. Lady Pemberton's expression hardened. "Victoria brought his request to me immediately. She was suspicious of his motives, and wanted my advice about how to respond. When she described him and mentioned his claimed background in Indian tea plantations, I knew immediately who he was." "So you agreed to his attendance," Bradshaw said, "but with the intention of confronting him about your sister's death." "More than confronting him, Inspector. I intended to ensure he faced justice for Margaret's murder. I had spent 3 years gathering additional evidence, tracking down witnesses who had since returned to England, building a case that would be impossible for the authorities to ignore." Poirot's green eyes were bright with interest. "And this evidence, where was it to be presented?" "I had arranged to meet with a representative from the Colonial Office the morning after the gala. Everything was prepared. Witness statements, financial records, even the Aya's testimony, which I had managed to obtain through trusted intermediaries. Marlowe would have been arrested within hours of my presentation." The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place with increasing clarity. David Marlowe had come to the gala, not knowing he was walking into a carefully prepared trap. Lady Pemberton had orchestrated his attendance, gathered the evidence to destroy him, and arranged for his arrest the following day. But someone had gotten to him first. "Lady Pemberton," Poirot said carefully, "did you inform anyone else about your plans for Mr. Marlowe? Did anyone else know about the evidence you had gathered, or your meeting with the Colonial Office?" Lady Pemberton glanced toward Mrs. Blackwood and Miss Hartwell before answering. "Only Victoria and Judith. They had been helping me with some of the research, using their connections to trace witnesses and gather documentation." "And on the evening of the gala itself, did you go to the wine cellar?" For the first time since beginning her story, Lady Pemberton hesitated. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I went to confront him, to tell him that I knew what he had done to Margaret, and that justice would finally be served. But when I arrived," she paused, her composure finally cracking. "When I arrived, he was already dead. Someone had gotten there before me." The revelation created a moment of profound silence in the drawing room. 3 women, each with their own connection to David Marlowe, each with their own reasons for wanting him dead. And one of them, despite Lady Pemberton's confession, had indeed gotten there first. Poirot's little grey cells were working furiously, but the final piece of the puzzle remained tantalizingly out of reach. Chapter 8. The Performance of Justice. The morning following Lady Pemberton's shocking revelation found Poirot in an unusual state of agitation. He paced his modest sitting room with uncharacteristic restlessness, pausing occasionally to adjust ornaments that were already perfectly aligned, or to straighten papers that showed no signs of disorder. Inspector Bradshaw, who had arrived for their scheduled consultation, watched this display with growing concern. "You seem troubled, Poirot. Surely Lady Pemberton's confession clarifies matters considerably." "Au contraire, mon ami," Poirot replied, continuing his pacing. "Lady Pemberton's story explains much about the victim's past and the motive for his murder, but it does not resolve the fundamental question of how he died. How he died. But surely that's clear." cyanide poisoning in the wine cellar. Poirot stopped his pacing and fixed Bradshaw with an intense stare. But administered how? And by whom? We now have 3 women, each with access to the victim, each with motive, and each claiming to have discovered the body rather than creating it. Bradshaw consulted his notes. Mrs. Blackwood was in the cellar at 10:30. Her perfume proves it. Lady Pemberton admits to going there to confront Marlowe. And Miss Hartwell? Ah yes, Miss Hartwell. The efficient secretary who helped organize the guest list, who assisted Lady Pemberton in gathering evidence against Marlowe, who has connections throughout London's charitable and social circles. Poirot resumed his pacing. Tell me, Inspector, what do we actually know about Miss Hartwell's movements during the gala? This question sent Bradshaw back through his notes with increasing urgency. As he reviewed the various testimonies and timelines, a troubling pattern began to emerge. She's mentioned in several contexts, Bradshaw said slowly, but always in the background. Lady Pemberton refers to her assistance with planning. Mrs. Blackwood mentions her help with research, but no one actually recalls speaking with her during the evening itself. Precisely. For someone who helped organize the event, Miss Hartwell remained remarkably invisible during its execution. And yet, Poirot moved to his desk and retrieved the notes he had made following their various interviews. Consider the facts. Miss Hartwell had access to the guest list and could have arranged for Marlowe's invitation. She assisted in gathering evidence against him and knew exactly what Lady Pemberton planned to do. She was one of the 3 women who received his photograph, yet she showed no romantic attachment to him, unlike the others. You think she was planning something all along? I think, mon ami, that Miss Hartwell is far more than the simple charitable secretary she appears to be. We must pay her another visit, and this time we must ask much more pointed questions. They found Miss Hartwell in her Bloomsbury flat, but she was not alone. She was receiving a visitor, a distinguished elderly gentleman with military bearing, whom she introduced as Colonel Pemberton, Lady Pemberton's older brother. Colonel Pemberton, Poirot said with interest. How fortunate to meet you. I trust your sister has informed you of recent developments. The Colonel's expression was grave. She has indeed, Mr. Poirot. A most distressing affair, though I confess I feel little sympathy for the victim. After what he did to our Margaret, indeed. And you, Colonel, were you aware of your sister's plans regarding Mr. Marlowe? Elizabeth consulted me about the evidence she had gathered. As Margaret's brother, I felt I had a duty to see justice done. I provided some assistance with the investigation, military connections in India, that sort of thing. Miss Hartwell had remained silent during this exchange, but Poirot noticed that her hands were trembling slightly as she poured tea. When she finally spoke, her voice was carefully controlled.
Colonel Pemberton has been most helpful in our efforts to honour Margaret's memory. He shares our commitment to seeing justice served. Justice, Poirot repeated thoughtfully. A noble concept, though one that can be interpreted in various ways. Tell me, Miss Hartwell, what is your particular understanding of justice in this case? I believe, she said firmly, that people who harm innocents should face appropriate consequences for their actions. David Marlowe destroyed lives for personal gain. Margaret Harrison was not his only victim. Ah, you knew of his other crimes? Colonel Pemberton's investigation revealed several suspicious deaths connected to Marlowe's activities in India. Margaret was part of a pattern, not an isolated incident. Bradshaw leaned forward with interest. Other victims? We weren't aware of additional murders. Colonel Pemberton reached into his briefcase and produced a folder of documents. I've spent considerable time researching Marlowe's activities in the Indian colonies. There were at least 3 other deaths that showed similar patterns. Wealthy widows or wives who had discovered his fraudulent activities, all dying suddenly of apparent natural causes, all having their personal papers ransacked shortly after death. The scope of David Marlowe's criminal activities was becoming clear, but Poirot was more interested in the implications for their current case. So when Mr. Marlowe returned to London, you were all prepared to ensure he faced justice for multiple murders. We were prepared to present evidence to the proper authorities, Miss Hartwell said carefully. Legal justice pursued through legitimate channels. And yet, Poirot observed, someone decided that legal justice was insufficient. Someone chose to administer a more immediate form of judgment. The room fell silent. Colonel Pemberton and Miss Hartwell exchanged a glance that spoke of shared understanding, shared secrets. When Miss Hartwell finally spoke, her voice carried a weight of conviction that transformed her from a simple secretary into something far more formidable. Mr. Poirot, you speak of justice as though it exists only in courtrooms and legal procedures. But what of the justice owed to victims whose voices can no longer be heard? What of the justice demanded by families who have waited years for resolution? Mademoiselle, are you confessing to murder? I am confessing to nothing more than a commitment to seeing wrongs set right. If David Marlowe died in that wine cellar, it was because his own actions had finally caught up with him. But Poirot's keen instincts told him there was more to this story. The careful phrasing, the shared glances between Miss Hartwell and Colonel Pemberton, the elaborate preparation that had gone into Marlowe's appearance at the gala, all suggested a plan far more sophisticated than simple poisoning. Miss Hartwell, he said quietly, I believe you have been performing a role throughout this entire affair. But the performance is over now. It is time for the truth. Miss Hartwell set down her teacup with deliberate precision. When she looked up at Poirot, her eyes held a combination of defiance and resignation. Very well, Mr. Poirot. You want the truth. The truth is that David Marlowe deserved to die for what he did to Margaret Harrison and the others. The truth is that the law had failed to protect innocent victims and would have failed again. And the truth is that sometimes justice requires those who can act to take responsibility for ensuring it is served. And how precisely did you ensure this justice was served? Miss Hartwell smiled, a cold, satisfied expression that revealed the steel beneath her mild exterior. By giving David Marlowe exactly what he had given his victims, a death that appeared natural but was anything but. The only difference was that he died knowing exactly why it was happening to him. Chapter 9. The Unmasking of the Truth. The tension in Miss Hartwell's modest sitting room was palpable as Poirot prepared to unravel the final threads of the mystery. Inspector Bradshaw sat with his notebook ready, while Colonel Pemberton and Miss Hartwell faced the famous detective with the resigned dignity of those who knew their careful plans were about to be exposed. Before we proceed, Poirot said carefully, I must ask you both to understand that anything revealed in this conversation may be used in legal proceedings. Are you prepared for that consequence? Miss Hartwell exchanged a glance with Colonel Pemberton before nodding. We are prepared, Mr. Poirot. We have been prepared for this possibility from the beginning. Très bien. Then let us examine how David Marlowe actually died, and why the true circumstances were so carefully concealed. Poirot settled himself in his chair, his green eyes bright with the intensity of revelation. The key to understanding this crime lies not in what happened in the wine cellar, but in what happened before Mr. Marlowe ever arrived there. He paused, allowing this statement to register before continuing. Miss Hartwell, your role in organizing Lady Pemberton's gala gave you access to every aspect of the evening's arrangements. You knew the guest list, the schedule of events, the layout of the hotel, and most importantly, you knew exactly when and where each participant would be throughout the evening. That's correct, Miss Hartwell admitted. You also knew through your collaboration with Lady Pemberton and Colonel Pemberton that David Marlowe was a systematic murderer who had killed at least 4 people in India. You knew that even if he were arrested and tried, there was no guarantee that justice would be served. Colonial justice is often incomplete, and wealthy criminals have many ways to escape consequences. Colonel Pemberton spoke for the first time. The legal system had already failed Margaret and the others. We couldn't risk it failing again. So you devised an alternative form of justice, Poirot continued. But it was not a simple poisoning in the wine cellar. The true crime was far more sophisticated than that. Bradshaw looked confused. But the cyanide, the cyanide. Poirot's eyes sparkled. Indeed, David Marlowe died of cyanide poisoning. But he did not die in the wine cellar, and he was not murdered by any of the 3 ladies who visited him there. The silence that followed this statement was profound. Miss Hartwell and Colonel Pemberton sat motionless, their faces revealing nothing, but Poirot could sense their surprise at his deduction. Consider the timeline, Poirot explained. Mr. Marlowe was seen alive and animated throughout the evening until approximately 10 o'clock. Mrs. Blackwood visited the wine cellar at 10:30 and found him dead. But here is the crucial detail. Cyanide acts within minutes of ingestion. If Mr. Marlowe had consumed cyanide in the wine cellar, he would have died immediately, not after 30 minutes of continued socializing. Then where? Bradshaw began. He died in the ballroom, Inspector. In full view of 200 guests, but in such a manner that no one realized what was happening. Poirot rose and began his characteristic pacing. Miss Hartwell, your knowledge of charitable organizations gave you access to information about various relief efforts, including medical supplies for veterans suffering from the effects of poison gas. Is that not correct? Miss Hartwell's composure finally cracked slightly. Yes, that's correct. And among those medical supplies were certain experimental treatments, including compounds that could delay the effects of certain poisons, allowing them to be administered well before their fatal action began. Colonel Pemberton leaned forward with obvious interest. You're suggesting that Marlowe was poisoned earlier in the evening. Not poisoned, Colonel, medicated. Miss Hartwell administered a carefully calculated dose of a delayed action compound during the evening's reception. To Marlowe, it would have seemed like nothing more than a cordial or aperitif offered by a helpful hostess. But when would she have had the opportunity? Bradshaw asked. That is where Miss Hartwell's invisible presence during the evening becomes significant. She moved through the gala not as a guest, but as an organizer, someone who could approach any attendee with offers of refreshment, assistance, or information without arousing suspicion. Poirot turned to face Miss Hartwell directly. You offered Mr. Marlowe a glass of champagne perhaps, or a canapé laced with your special preparation, something that would take effect precisely 30 minutes later, giving you time to be elsewhere when the symptoms began. Miss Hartwell's smile was grim but admiring. You are very perceptive, Mr. Poirot. Yes, I offered David a glass of champagne at approximately 9:30. I told him it was a special vintage that Lady Pemberton was serving to honor her late sister's memory. He found that quite appropriate. And the compound you used? A delayed-release cyanide preparation developed for military use, designed to allow poison gas victims to receive medication that would counteract exposure, but with a delayed effect to ensure maximum therapeutic benefit. Her voice took on a bitter edge. It seemed fitting that a medication designed to save lives should be repurposed to take the life of someone who had destroyed so many others. But why the elaborate deception with the wine cellar? Bradshaw demanded. Colonel Pemberton answered this question. Because we needed witnesses to establish that Marlowe was alive after the poison was administered. If he had simply collapsed in the ballroom at 9:30, Judith would have been the obvious suspect. But if multiple people could testify to seeing him alive later in the evening, then the investigation would focus on those later encounters. Poirot finished. Very clever. You arranged for Mrs. Blackwood to meet him in the wine cellar, knowing she would discover the body and become a suspect. You also ensured that Lady Pemberton would visit the cellar to confront him, providing another potential suspect. We never intended for Victoria or Elizabeth to be seriously implicated, Miss Hartwell said urgently. We knew that investigation would ultimately reveal the impossibility of their guilt. The timing would not work, the method would be unclear. We simply needed to create enough confusion to ensure the focus remained on the evening's events rather than the earlier administration of the poison. And you, Miss Hartwell, what was your role once the poison took effect? I made sure to be seen clearly by multiple witnesses throughout the period when David would have been dying. I was helping in the kitchen, checking on the musicians, ensuring that everything was proceeding smoothly with the gala. At least 20 people can confirm my presence upstairs when David died in the wine cellar. Poirot nodded slowly. A perfect alibi, created by perfect planning. But you made one small error in your calculations. What error? You assumed that David Marlowe would go quietly to his appointment with death. But Marlowe was a survivor. He had been running from justice for years, and his instincts for danger were highly developed. When he began to feel the effects of the poison, he knew immediately what was happening. Miss Hartwell's face went pale. How could you possibly know that? Because, mademoiselle, he left a message, hidden in the wine cellar where only someone examining the scene very carefully would find it. Poirot reached into his jacket and produced a small piece of paper.
scraped into the dust beneath one of the wine racks, almost illegible, but still readable. J.H. Champagne 930. He identified his killer and the method, even as he was dying. The revelation struck Miss Hartwell like a physical blow. For the first time since their investigation began, she appeared truly shaken. He knew, she whispered. He knew it was me. He knew, and he ensured that justice would ultimately be served, even if it was not the justice you had planned. Chapter 10. The Final Verdict. The arrest of Miss Judith Hartwell and Colonel Pemberton for the murder of David Marlowe created a sensation in London society that would be remembered for years to come. The revelation that a respected charitable secretary and a distinguished military officer had collaborated in an elaborate revenge killing shocked even those who acknowledged that the victim had deserved his fate. Inspector Bradshaw, despite his admiration for Poirot's deductive abilities, found himself struggling with the moral complexities of the case as they sat in the detectives' rooms 3 days after the arrests. "I can't help feeling," Bradshaw admitted, "that justice was served in some sense. Marlowe was a murderer who would never have faced proper consequences for his crimes." Poirot was carefully arranging his morning correspondence, but he paused to consider the inspector's comment. "And yet, mon ami, what Miss Hartwell and Colonel Pemberton did was also murder. Carefully planned, methodically executed murder. Are we to decide which victims deserve justice and which do not? But surely the circumstances make the crime understandable, even sympathetic. They do not make it legal." Poirot set down his letters and faced Bradshaw directly. "This case troubles me precisely because it forces us to confront the inadequacy of human justice. David Marlowe was indeed a killer who had escaped consequences for his actions, but the response to imperfect justice cannot be private execution." A knock at the door interrupted their philosophical discussion. Mrs. Victoria Blackwood entered, looking considerably more composed than she had during the previous week's dramatic revelations. She carried a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Mr. Poirot," she said, "I wanted to thank you for your discretion during this difficult affair. I also wanted to return this." She unwrapped the package to reveal the silver locket containing David Marlowe's photograph. "I think it's better if all traces of that man's deception are destroyed." "Madame," Poirot said gently, "you were as much a victim in this affair as anyone. Miss Hartwell manipulated your sympathy for an old acquaintance to serve her own purposes of revenge. Perhaps, but I still feel responsible for bringing David into contact with people who wanted him dead. If I had been more suspicious, more careful, then a murderer might have continued to escape justice, and other innocent victims might have died. You cannot blame yourself for showing compassion, even when that compassion was exploited by others." Mrs. Blackwood nodded, though her expression remained troubled. "What will happen to Judith and Colonel Pemberton? That will be determined by the courts," Bradshaw replied. "Though given the circumstances and the character of the victim, I suspect the sentences will be considerate." After Mrs. Blackwood departed, Poirot and Bradshaw were joined by Lady Pemberton, who had requested a final meeting to discuss the resolution of the case. She appeared to have aged considerably during the past week, the strain of revelations and arrests having taken a visible toll on her elegant composure. "I feel I owe you an explanation, Mr. Poirot," she began, "about my role in these events and my knowledge of what Judith was planning. You knew of Miss Hartwell's intentions, not specifically, no, but I knew she was frustrated with the limitations of legal justice. When we were gathering evidence against David, she made several comments about the need for more direct action. I thought she was simply speaking emotionally, not planning actual murder." Poirot studied Lady Pemberton's weary face. "And yet you did nothing to prevent her involvement in the gala arrangements." "I trusted her judgment. She had been so helpful, so dedicated to honoring Margaret's memory. I never imagined she would take matters into her own hands so completely." Lady Pemberton's voice carried the weight of guilt and regret. "If I had been more attentive, perhaps I could have prevented this tragedy." "Madame," Poirot said compassionately, "the tragedy was not David Marlowe's death. It was the corruption of good people by their desire for justice. Miss Hartwell and Colonel Pemberton allowed their righteous anger to transform them into the very thing they sought to destroy." "And what of my sister Margaret?" Does she receive any justice at all from these events? The justice she receives, madame, is that her story has been told. Her courage in standing against David Marlowe has been revealed, and her memory has been honored by those who loved her. Sometimes, that is the only justice the dead can claim. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Miss Caroline Pemberton, Lady Pemberton's daughter, who had been conspicuously absent from the recent proceedings. She entered with the nervous energy of someone bearing important news. "Mother," she said breathlessly, "I've just come from the courthouse. The magistrate has made his decision about Miss Hartwell and Colonel Pemberton." Lady Pemberton asked anxiously, "Manslaughter, not murder. 7 years for Miss Hartwell, 5 for Colonel Pemberton, with the possibility of early release for good behavior." The judge said the exceptional circumstances and the character of the victim warranted leniency. Bradshaw nodded with satisfaction. "A just outcome, I think. They'll serve time for their crime, but they won't hang for removing a killer from the world." "There is one more matter," Caroline continued, reaching into her handbag. "Miss Hartwell asked me to give you this, Mr. Poirot. She said you would understand its significance." She handed Poirot a small envelope containing a single photograph, not the portrait from Mr. Finch's studio, but an older image showing a young woman in colonial dress standing beside a man in military uniform. On the back was written, "Margaret and Charles Harrison, Calcutta, 1920. She wanted you to remember that this was never about revenge," Caroline explained. "It was about love, love for a sister who died trying to protect others from a killer." Poirot examined the photograph carefully, noting the happiness in the young couple's faces, the optimism that characterized their final year together, before David Marlowe entered their lives. When he looked up, his green eyes were bright with understanding. "Mademoiselle Caroline, please convey to Miss Hartwell that her message is received and comprehended. What she did was wrong, but the love that motivated it was pure. That distinction will matter when she faces her own judgment." As the Pembertons took their leave, Poirot found himself alone with his thoughts and the complex emotions stirred by the case. The gentleman in the crimson waistcoat had indeed been a killer who deserved justice, but the justice administered had corrupted those who served it. "A most unsatisfactory resolution," he murmured to the empty room. "The guilty are punished, but the innocent are also wounded. The dead are avenged, but at the cost of creating new victims of circumstance." Yet, as he carefully filed away his notes on the case, Poirot acknowledged that such moral ambiguity was perhaps inevitable in a world where human justice remained forever imperfect. Sometimes the best that could be achieved was to ensure that the truth was revealed, even when that truth satisfied no one completely. The afternoon post brought a final communication related to the case, a brief letter from the Colonial Office confirming that David Marlowe's crimes in India would now be officially investigated, and that posthumous justice would be sought for his victims there. It was a small consolation, but it suggested that Margaret Harrison's courage in gathering evidence had not been entirely in vain. As evening fell over London, Poirot prepared his simple dinner and reflected on the strange case that had begun with a charming stranger at a charity gala, and ended with the exposure of multiple murders spanning 2 continents. The gentleman in the crimson waistcoat would be remembered not for his charisma or his elaborate deceptions, but as a reminder that evil often wears an attractive mask, and that the pursuit of justice, however noble its intentions, can lead even good people down dark paths. In his final notes on the case, Poirot wrote, "The death of David Marlowe serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of taking justice into one's own hands. Yet it also reminds us that true justice is not merely the punishment of the guilty, but the protection of the innocent, a responsibility that belongs not to individuals seeking revenge, but to society as a whole." The gentleman in the crimson waistcoat received the death he had earned through his crimes, but the manner of that death diminished rather than enhanced the cause of justice. And with that philosophical conclusion, Hercule Poirot closed the file on one of his most morally complex cases, knowing that while the mystery had been solved, the questions it raised about justice, revenge, and the price of moral compromise would linger long after the legal proceedings had ended. Thus concluded the affair of the gentleman in the crimson waistcoat, a case that would be discussed in drawing rooms and legal circles for years to come, not for its ingenious solution, but for its troubling reminder that in the pursuit of justice, even the most well-intentioned can lose their way. Here ends our tale from the Cozy Mysteries collection. I'm Stephen, and I thank you for joining me in this exploration of one of Hercule Poirot's most challenging cases, a reminder that truth once revealed can be both illuminating and deeply unsettling.